So thanks for attending, everybody. In this presentation today, we're going to be doing a comparative look at SOLIDWORKS Manage versus SOLIDWORKS PDM and their differing workflow functionalities. PDM Professional is our flagship CAD data management vaulting solution that you all know. And SOLIDWORKS Manage is a whole other level beyond that of analytics, reporting, full engineering BOM and lifecycle management, process and project management. Manage and PDM integrate natively to one another, each extending the other's capabilities enormously. But both of these systems bring workflow to the table. And so the question frequently comes up when you're talking about PDM and Manage is, what is it that manages process management can do that PDM workflow can't do, and vice versa? So first, let's start with some common ground. Now, both systems employ workflow functionality to regulate business process decisions, access rights, change control, and a whole host of other things that we know that workflow is meant to do in these types of systems, right? It's sort of integral to the lifeblood of this type of software. If you're familiar with PDM, a couple of just grabs of workflow screenshots here. Both systems have visual programming interfaces, object-based programmers to make building workflows very easy. If you recognize PDM workflows, managed workflows look strikingly different, although you'll recognize them as workflows. Architecturally, they're a little bit different in terms of how you structure them and the logic behind them and so forth, but you'll recognize them immediately as process flows. Maybe a little nod to Manage and some great swim lane and coloring options that PDM doesn't have. But if you looked at the two systems and you were checking boxes and you said, well, can it workflow? Well, the answer is yes, they can both workflow. So one most common question I think that we get in the field all the time is whether managed process decisions can drive PDM workflow. And the answer is yes, it can. These systems are natively integrated to one another by SOLIDWORKS, and they're built to do that. Let's first define a few terms. Throughout the course of this webinar, I'm sure I'm going to say the word workflow and process 1,000 times. We'll also be talking about terms like lifecycle and status, and state, things like that. Now, typically when we're talking about workflow and process, we're talking about non-cyclical process flows for decision-making and determining outcomes. A process record is a record in the act of being workflowed from the perspective of Manage. So process implies a linear flow. So it's not going to cycle back on itself. If you need another decision, you will create a new process and make a new determination using an entirely new process record. Now, with life cycling and workflow states and such, typically we're talking about a reoccurring status or label that is applied to controlled and process managed records or files. So the key piece here that differentiates it is that it's typically an indicator on affected items or files, right? So for life cycling, opposed to workflowing, we're talking about the affected items and not necessarily the process flow itself. So files are given statuses as they go through in terms of what their current life cycle is. Is it in process? Is it released? Is it checked in? This is cyclical in nature, as you'd assume. Is it obsolete? Now, life cycling is required for systems to do basic revision control. All right, so a file, unlike a process, needs to hit these same life cycles again and again and again to be re-released at new revisions typically. Maybe obsolete is a dead end, but generally speaking, there is a cycle. PDM workflows are file-centric, and what we mean by that is it's actually the files that are vaulted in the PDM solution that are going through the workflow. So the workflow is the route path that a file will follow in PDM, right? So the file itself is not a process. A part file or an Excel file or whatever it is that you're workflowing are just following a track. And generally they're all following the same track or one of a few different tracks. Now, PDM provides dual purpose workflow generally. So its workflow engine is actually providing process approval on the workflow side, and it's also in the process side, and it's also providing lifecycle mapping for status and revision control. So approval points are made in a PDM workflow, and as well, it's cyclical in nature. So it's always going to come back to reset for the next time through, but I'm going to use the same workflow, and the file would sort of rinse and repeat over time. Now, with SOLIDWORKS Manage processes, process is a record in and of itself. Manage uses process-centric workflow engine, and what I mean by that is it's only the process record, say like an ECO or a Kappa, that is actually being workflowed. So process records can have affected items, like we can attach CAD files or other types of non-file-based records or Word documents or what have you to a process, but those affected items in and of themselves are not following the track of the workflow, only the process record is. So these affected items are then in turn life-cycled by the managed process record. So like I said, only the process record follows the route and is workflowed. The things that it is going to drive to revision or lifecycle are merely affected by the process record and are not in and of themselves following a workflow track. So as this ECO goes through its process, it would then lifecycle and change the affected items based on the rules of that workflow. Or so when I complete the ECO, for example, it's going to release the affected items. So there's a reciprocal relationship, but it's a much different paradigm than what you see in PDM, where the files themselves are what are going through the workflow track. Okay, let me jump over to Manage, or well, actually, we'll jump over to PDM here first. And we're going to look at PDM Vault. Make sure I'm in the right vault here. And I just want to show you a live representation of a PDM file following a workflow track. Now, one kind of long-standing complaint about PDM is you can't actually see the workflow diagram as an end user. So files follow workflow. I can see an indication of the current status here. These are all currently in work. And I can do what's called state change in PDM, and this is to initiate files, and they can bring references with them to follow a preordained track. So this is a transition. I'm going to be submitting these files for review. And then from review, there would be options based on that workflow that the administrators have built in the background. So from a PDM perspective, then as an approver, I'm going to come in and say, I'm either going to say change required or release to production. So if I say change required, that would route these records back to in work. If I do that again, and I say change state, submit for production review, but this time I decide to release them. This time they would go to release and a rev would be set. Okay, so now we have revisions. So this is sort of the nature of PDM in that you are doing revisions on files themselves. Now, and you can have multiple different workflows that act differently on different types of files, but it's the file records that are being vaulted in this solution that are actually undergoing workflow transitions and changes. This is much different than what happens in SOLIDWORKS Manage. One thing I'll say is that you can do change control in PDM, but it's not as fully blown. It's sort of like you'll see oftentimes PDM customers using what's called a user-defined reference to basically to take like an ECO file document, because everything in PDM is a file, like an ECO. Maybe it's an Excel file, and you can take, say, CAD data or other records and paste as a reference to another file document. And then you can coordinate workflows to maybe have a bit of interaction with one another. But ultimately, the paste as reference in PDM is really a hierarchical reference structure, and it's really made for bills of material to kind of amend BOMs. And so oftentimes on a change order process, you don't want the parent-child structure from the CAD. You want to cherry pick just the records that you need. You do have oftentimes need to pull in references and such on a process record, but PDM is always looking at that full product record track from the CAD BOM. And so oftentimes the way that you can do change management in PDM is just not quite as effective as a system like Manage that's been designed to do it. Let's take a look at the Manage interface here. You haven't seen Manage before. It has its own client interface, and it can be integrated to actually one or even multiple vaults. I have several customers that are integrating Manage with a number of their different vaults. So in this case, Manage is a standalone application that is then natively integrated into this PDM data source, right? So all of the files that you see in here, I would also find in the PDM Vault in the Windows Explorer. So if I were to come into PDM generally and navigate through a window structure and go to this folder, I would see some files and some records. And we'll see those same records in Manage. Manage, by the way, also can manage its own files, including CAD data, and manage bills of material, and test records, and quality data, and standard operating procedures, and all the sort of flotsam and jetsam that companies need to manage to define the full product record. Now in Manage, we have a number of different modules. So I'm looking at our records module here, where all of your product records would be stored. And we have a fully separate process records module. So one thing of perhaps interest is that process and the files, the records that we're managing are completely divorced from one another. They have relationships like references to one another, but they are separate things. And to demonstrate how different this is conceptually from what you do in PDM, where you put a file in a vault and you workflow that file, in Manage, I'm going to create a process record that really has nothing to do with other records. It's just for maybe tracking a problem. I'm going to come in here to my problem report process record. I'm going to create a new problem report. All right, I'm going to save that. Well, actually, I won't. But one nice thing about Manage I really love is that you can see the workflow map from the user interface. And even though you see a loop here, workflow or process, they're always kind of linear. There's a start and an end. It's going to complete. There's never going to be a cyclical loop. If you need another process record, you just create another one. So I've created, say, a simple little problem report, and I could actually attach affected items here to this problem report. So for example, I could go in and say, okay, I need to add that record and that record. I noticed some problem with these records, and I'm going to do a causal analysis on what the issue was and things like that. So, but I won't, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and I could send this through to an ECO. In this case, I'm just going to deal with process on its own terms right now and not deal with affected items as such in Manage. So what I'm going to do is send this to the next stage in the workflow. And one nice thing about the history record in Manage is that it steps you through, kind of shows you where you've been, who did what along the way. The other thing too that's really unique is the named user assignment. So you can specifically assign individuals rather than just strictly roles. So you kind of have your cake and can eat it too. It's much more flexible than PDM in that regard. So as the assigned problem reviewer, I'm going to accept this process, but it's asking me to make a decision. So what I want to do is, based on this problem analysis that I'm working up here, in the end, what I want it to do is I want it to go create an ECO for me. So this is one fundamental difference between Manage and PDM, is that the workflow is a record in and of itself. It's a process record, and these process records can interact with one another and create one another. So the idea here is this problem report at the end of the day is going to, when it completes, is going to create an ECO for me. So, and it's going to warn me about that. Are you sure you want to move to the next stage? Yep. And if I do, it's warning me this problem report is going to close and initiate an ECO. Are you sure? Yes, let's do it. All right, so let's take a look at that closed problem report. And you'll see here, I've got a link directly to the ECO that it created. I could travel over to my ECO object record, but let's just hyperlink and navigate over. I could open it directly from here too. So I don't even need to navigate directly to the record, or I could. I'm going to say go to record. It'll jump me over to my ECO. And this could have a full array of affected items already pinned to it from the problem report. In this case, I kind of wanted to show you just adding affected items naturally to an empty ECO, but I could already have indicated the records that had the issues. With this ECO, I'm going to accept the process as the named engineer that's going to be running it. Take a look at who's done what, the history, what we have in store for us on this process record. And we're going to add some affected items. Now you can determine which other record sources within the environment, including one or multiple PDM vaults, can be affected by this process record. I'm going to dive into this PDM Vault here from Manage. Do something you can't do in a Windows environment is I'm going to show this auto filter row, and I'm particularly interested in files with the name cube in them. Love that aspect of Manage. I'm going to dump all of this stuff on the affected item here, and I can actually see, if we're talking about lifecycle, that all of these files are already released. Now, I'm not going to go through the pretense of going and working on these files. They're currently Rev B, but I will be showing you, back to the PowerPoint earlier, how Manage is able to drive PDM workflows and its own life cycles. So currently, these records, let me just save this process record for a second. Take a look at one of these. If I go to that record, you can see that it's currently in the released lifecycle status, and that has implications in terms of your access rights and a whole bunch of other things. So I'll take a look at the where used. I'll navigate back to that current ECO that it's on. I'll go to that record, or actually, you know what would have been even cooler is I could just open that ECO directly from the where used on that object. Right, so everything's linked together. So if you need to coordinate and link records, processes, Manage is the way to go. It's amazingly capable in that regard. So let's process these files. And of note, these are both files that are being lifecycled in Manage as well, might be on bills of materials as well, but they are also files in PDM. And I guess I should have gone there first. So let's go take a look at that record in the PDM Vault, and I want you to note that it is currently in the PDM released status. So the files in PDM are still in their PDM workflows, but now we're going to have Manage drive that workflow. So we don't need to operate on two sides of the fence. So we can have one master process that is going to do the PDM workflow. And actually, this is basically reverting the PDM workflow functionality into a bit of a lifecycle status. It's not really used for workflow anymore. So for example, on the administrative side, I'll show you how simple a workflow you really need for PDM when you're talking use of Manage. This is all that I'm doing in PDM. It's either in work or it's released, and I'm going to entirely drive that with Manage. Okay, so back to our process record. Go take a look at that ECO. And I happen to be the named assigned engineer. This has various roles in terms of who has to do what in this workflow. And of course, I'm rubber stamping this all through as the system admin, but I'm sure you can appreciate that this would be the job function of several individuals. So I'm going to send it to work in process. We'll send to next stage again, which is going to land us in engineering review. Sure, you want to move it to the next stage? Yes, please. Okay, now let's just pause here for a second because I want you to appreciate what's going on behind the scenes. Look at how all of the affected items have changed lifecycle statuses down here. So this is their managed lifecycle. They're all in process, and this locks them up. So even though, and simultaneously, that managed workflow process was also let's go over to the Windows Explorer, had also transitioned the files from released in work in PDM, which also unlocked them for edit rights in the Windows environment as well. So this process that I'm managing here is kind of a puppet master pulling all the strings for releasing all of these affected items. So the final bit then is to accept, and we're about at the tail end of this workflow process. I can see, who started it, where it's gone, how it's progressed, and as I send it to the next stage, if I've forgotten to do something like provide a decision, it's going to say, nope, an engineering decision is required. All right, so let's say I approve as my engineering decision. And then so I'll save this on and we'll close out that workflow. It says I'm going to release the ECO, yes please. And that will then release all of the affected items, both in Manage and in PDM, as one complete closed loop system that operates both on our classic PDM vaulting solution as well as this full PLM level distributed data management solution. And let's go over to the actual PDM file view. So you can see them released in Manage, but let's see them released in the PDM Vault as well. So here's the new release state. And I didn't have to do any manual transitions in PDM. So Manage is taking care of all of that, right? Setting revisions, running it through the stages in PDM. Okay, so I hope that's given us sort of an appreciation for some of the differences and some of the benefits of adding Manage into your existing PDM environments. At least maybe some food for thought.